I was sipping my morning coffee on the porch when a sudden crackle of electricity and the stench of burning wood hit my nose, followed by the sight of smoke curling from my fence line where a team of neon-vested workers had just drilled straight through my property sign. One of them yelled something about community power expansion, and before I could blink, the wire they were hanging sparked like a live snake and snapped against my fence, setting dry grass ablaze as my horses bolted in panic. I dropped the mug, sprinted across the yard, and the first words out of my mouth were not polite or patient. They were the kind that make birds stop singing. The foreman, a sweaty man with a clipboard and zero common sense, stammered, "Sir, the HOA approved this route." I looked at him dead in the eye and said, "That's great, but the HOA doesn't own this land." "I do." He blinked, confused, as if I had told him the sky was privately managed. In the middle of my smoking pasture, a white SUV rolled up, clean and smug, with the letters HOA President emblazoned on a magnetic sticker across the door. Out stepped Karen, her sunglasses perched like she was surveying a kingdom, waving a brochure that might as well have been a royal decree. "You're overreacting," she said, her tone sugary and sharp at once. "This is for the good of the community. The new power line will increase property values." I glanced at the blackened fence post still smoldering and said, "Well, it just decreased mine." That was the moment the wind shifted, blowing ash across her white coat, and the look on her face, half disgust, half disbelief, was worth a painting. She strutted toward me, heels sinking into the dirt, her voice climbing higher as she tried to sound authoritative. "We sent notices last month," she snapped. "Your land falls within the HOA jurisdiction per our new boundary update." I laughed, not the polite kind, but the kind that makes everyone else uncomfortable. "Lady," I said, "your HOA boundary ends 2 miles before my fence. You can't redraw maps with crayons and call it law." Her eyes twitched, but she waved to her crew to keep working. That's when the second wire popped loose, arcing dangerously close to her SUV, and she screamed loud enough to startle the horses again. The crew jumped back, cursing, while she shouted something about suing the contractor. I watched the chaos unfold and thought, this was the dumbest trespass I'd ever witnessed. But as funny as it looked, I felt the anger settle deep, like a low-voltage hum under my skin. They were building power lines through land I inherited, land I'd repaired and paid taxes on for years. And now some HOA committee thought they could run their cables across it like it was a sidewalk. Once the smoke cleared, I took photos of everything, the burned grass, the tire marks, even the coil of wire still sparking faintly. Karen crossed her arms, trying to recover her composure. "Look," she said in a calmer tone, "you'll be compensated. The HOA has an agreement with the electric company." I said, "Oh really? Show me." She hesitated, then fumbled through her bag for papers she clearly hadn't read. "It's standard procedure," she mumbled, "community access, shared resources." I interrupted, "Forged signatures, you mean?" Her jaw locked, and she said nothing. The silence was enough. The foreman quietly signaled his crew to step away from the trench. Karen looked between us like she still had authority, but the power in her voice had flickered out. I told her plainly, "You've got until sunset to move your trucks off my land. After that, there's scrap." She tried to call my bluff. "You wouldn't dare," she said. "We're improving the area." I smiled just enough to make her nervous and replied, "Lady, this land ran fine on candlelight before your kind showed up. We'll survive another night without your lights." When she stormed off, leaving dust and perfume behind, I felt that slow boil of amusement and fury mix into something sharper. The scene looked ridiculous. An HOA president acting like a monarch, a burnt fence line, and a group of workers too scared to touch another wire. Yet behind it all was something serious. They had entered without permission, laid infrastructure across private property, and assumed I'd just shrug it off. That arrogance was their weakness, and I could already feel the edges of an idea forming. I spent the rest of the day pacing the boundary, checking survey markers, and flipping through the folder of land deeds my grandfather had left me. Every inch of wire they'd strung ran through property legally mine. They didn't just trespass. They built a power line that could legally make them owe me every kilowatt they transmitted. That night, I sat on my porch again, the stars glimmering faintly over the dark fields, and watched the new poles stand like an insult across my land. The hum of the distant transformer carried through the still air, an uninvited sound. I thought about Karen's words, "for the good of the community." That phrase stuck like a thorn. It was always the same kind of people saying that, the kind who think community means everyone else paying for their decisions. I opened my laptop, searched the county's energy filings, and found exactly what I expected. The HOA had filed for a local power partnership using falsified consent forms, including one that claimed I was a participant. They even misspelled my name. That made me laugh again, louder this time. They had built their entire project on a foundation of lies, and I suddenly knew exactly what to do. The next morning, I drove to the county office, where the clerk, a kind old man who had seen every rural dispute imaginable, nearly spit out his coffee when I showed him the paperwork. "They didn't even notarize this," he said, chuckling. "Amateurs." I told him what they'd done, and he nodded slowly. "You can press charges, sure. But if I were you, I'd hit them where it hurts." I raised an eyebrow. "The wallet?" He grinned. "The power bill." That sentence was like flipping a switch inside my head. I realized I didn't just want revenge. I wanted poetic justice. If they wanted to run electricity through my land, I'd make sure every volt cost them double. When I left the office, I drove past the construction site again. The workers were gone, the wires hung limp, and Karen's SUV wasn't there. Only the sound of wind rattling through half-finished poles remained. I parked, stood at the center of my field, and stared at the shiny new transformer box sitting neatly on my soil. The irony made me laugh so hard it echoed through the hills. They had wired their entire grid through my property without realizing I was about to own it all. The sun glared off the metal, and in that light, I saw not just a trespass, but an opportunity glowing back at me. It was in that moment I decided, if they wanted power, I'd give it to them. But on my terms, and under my name. What started as smoke and sparks at my fence line was about to turn into the brightest lesson an HOA ever learned. The next morning, the air still smelled faintly of burned grass, and I could see the dull glint of those power poles stretching across my land like scars. The anger had cooled overnight, replaced by something sharper and calmer, the kind of focus that comes when you stop reacting and start planning. I drove into town with a folder full of deeds, tax receipts, and property surveys tucked under my arm like a weapon. The county building was half empty that early in the morning, and the fluorescent lights inside made everything look pale and official. When I walked up to the clerk's desk, the same older man from yesterday greeted me with a knowing grin and said, "Back so soon?" I dropped the folder on the counter and replied, "We're going to make sure the HOA never plays electrician again." He adjusted his glasses, flipping through my documents with slow, deliberate movements, humming every few seconds. "Well," he said finally, "you're the sole owner of Parcel 22B, no public easement, no right-of-way. What they did isn't just trespassing, it's commercial encroachment." I asked him what that meant in real-world terms, and he chuckled. "It means you can either sue them for damages or make them pay rent for every foot of wire they strung across your dirt." I could already see the humor in that, the idea of the HOA sending me monthly checks just to keep their porch lights on. But I wasn't done. I wanted to know exactly how far they had gone. So I headed to the land records office on the second floor, where a young assistant was sorting through digital copies of construction permit. When I gave her the HOA name, she looked hesitant and said quietly, "We've been getting complaints about them all week." That caught my attention. She opened a file and turned her monitor toward me. There it was, an application labeled Community Power Enhancement Initiative, signed not by the electric company but by Karen herself, claiming to represent all landowners in the area. My signature was there too, except it looked like it had been written by someone holding a pen for the first time. The assistant whispered, "They even attached a map with hand-drawn lines showing new HOA boundaries. They basically redrew the entire district." I leaned in closer, studying the map, and sure enough, my property, 300 acres of open pasture, was conveniently marked as shared community land. My laugh startled her. "They really thought this would pass," I said. She smiled nervously and said, "You can file a complaint with the zoning board." I thanked her, but in my mind, the plan was already moving beyond paperwork. I didn't want to just stop them. I wanted to own the very thing they had tried to take. I stopped for lunch at the diner across the street, the kind of small-town place where gossip travels faster than the coffee pot. The waitress, a friend of mine named Lila, noticed the stack of documents I was reading and said, "Don't tell me you're fighting the HOA again." I said, "Oh, not fighting. Just rewiring the battlefield." She laughed, pouring me another cup. The idea had started to take shape in my mind. The power line that cut through my property wasn't just connected to my field. It linked straight into the regional grid run by a small, struggling utility company known for bad management and late maintenance. If that company was in trouble, it meant someone with the right timing could buy a piece of it, maybe even the controlling piece. And if I could own the grid itself, the HOA would be paying me for every flicker of light they used. It was a ridiculous idea, but the more I thought about it, the more perfect it seemed. That afternoon I drove 2 towns over to meet an old friend named Henry, a retired attorney who now spent most of his days fishing and occasionally helping locals untangle property dispute. He greeted me with his usual dry humor. "If this is another Karen story," he said, "I might start charging you entertainment tax." I handed him the papers. "She ran power lines through my ranch." He raised his eyebrows. "That's new. Most Karens stick to fences and noise complaints." As he read through the fake authorization forms, his smile faded. "This isn't just a violation," he said. "This is fraud. They forged consent to connect infrastructure across private property. You could take them to court and win without breaking a sweat." I said, "What if instead of suing them, I buy the company that owns the wires?" He looked at me for a long second, then laughed so hard he coughed. "You're serious, aren't you?" I nodded. He leaned back and said, "It's bold. And crazy. Which means it might actually work. You'd need to find out who owns the utility shares, though." I told him I'd handle that part. He grinned and said, "Just promise me one thing. When you pull the plug, invite me to watch." I spent the next few days researching that utility company. They were small, locally managed, and publicly traded, but barely. Most of their shares were owned by old investors who hadn't checked their portfolios in years. Their financial report was a mess. High maintenance costs, unpaid accounts, and a list of disputes that stretched longer than a barn wall. They were losing money fast, and the HOA deal was supposed to be their community partnership lifeline. In other words, I had perfect timing. With a few strategic calls and a little capital I had saved from leasing cattle pastures, I could start buying shares quietly without raising eyebrows. The more I read, the more it felt like fate had wired this plan for me. A few days later, I visited the construction site again. The workers were back, finishing the line like nothing had happened, pretending they had full permission. Karen was there too, wearing a new hat and a face full of confidence, giving orders like a general in a battle she thought she'd already won. She saw me and forced a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, it's you again," she said. "I hope you've come to your senses." I replied, "Actually, I came to see how it feels watching someone else build my retirement fund." She frowned, clearly not understanding. "You'll find out soon," I added before walking away. The look she gave me was priceless, part confusion, part irritation. She still thought she was untouchable. That was fine. I needed her to stay that way a little longer. Over the next week, I went through legal channels quietly. The county clerk helped me file an official notice of property violation. It meant that every structure, pole, or wire on my land now had a pending legal hold until ownership was clarified. The HOA would get a copy of that notice soon, but by then I'd already be several steps ahead. I met with a financial advisor who confirmed my hunch about the power company's condition. "They're desperate for investors," he said. "They'd sell their own transformers if it kept them afloat." I smiled at that. "Good," I said, "because I'm about to buy their entire current flow." The process wasn't simple, but I was patient. Each transaction, each signature brought me closer to a truth that would make Karen's smug grin disappear forever. By the end of the week, the rumors had already started spreading around town. People were whispering about how I was planning something big. Lila called it electrical revenge. Henry called it the most satisfying lawsuit never filed. I didn't confirm or deny anything. I just smiled and kept working on the details. The day before the HOA's scheduled ribbon-cutting ceremony, I received an official email from the utility company thanking me for becoming a significant minority shareholder. That meant I had voting power. Not enough to control everything yet, but enough to make decisions that would start changing the current, literally. I leaned back in my chair, reading that email over and over, thinking about how they had burned my fence just days ago. The same wires that trespassed across my field were now technically under my influence. It wasn't complete victory yet, but it was close enough to taste. I looked out the window at the horizon where those poles stood tall and silent against the sky, and I whispered to myself, "Let them flip the switch. Soon, they'll learn whose power they're really using." By the time the next week rolled in, my quiet little ranch had become the center of an invisible storm. Every day I woke up to the same sight, those silver poles cutting through my pasture, humming faintly with the stolen current that the HOA thought belonged to them. But what they didn't know was that I had already begun stringing wires of my own, the kind that ran through banks, emails, and silent signatures. I was now an investor, not in cattle or crops, but in voltage itself. I had bought just enough shares of the power company to start attending their internal meetings. The first one I joined was virtual, a gray-faced lineup of exhausted executives trying to sound confident as their balance sheets begged for mercy. When it was my turn to speak, I introduced myself simply as a new shareholder from the 22B parcel area, and the moment I said those numbers, the CEO looked up, confused. "Isn't that the property with the HOA expansion line?" he asked. I smiled into the webcam. "It is. And that's exactly why I'm here." That meeting was the start of something bigger than I expected. I wasn't just fighting a local HOA anymore. I was learning how to control their lifeline from the inside out. Each night, I went through financial filings, purchase records, and stock reports. The company had been selling shares quietly to raise money for community upgrades, the same upgrades the HOA bragged about. The irony was perfect. Their little power stunt had accidentally funded my entry into their supplier's ownership. They were literally paying for the rope I'd hang their grid with. Meanwhile, Karen continued her parade of pride, telling everyone in town that our new power system is nearly complete. I heard her once at the grocery store, boasting to a small group of residents about how she'd negotiated access with all landowners. I stood a few aisles away, pretending to read labels, biting back a laugh. She was so proud of her imaginary power, unaware that every word she spoke was tightening the noose she'd built around herself. Later that week, I visited the company's local operations office, a small building that looked like it hadn't been painted since the 90s. The manager there, a man named Dale, seemed like the kind who had seen too many small-town arguments but stayed neutral as long as his paycheck arrived on time. When I mentioned my land and the new line, he sighed. "Oh, that project. It's been a headache since day one. The HOA was supposed to provide legal access forms, but we never got the originals. The higher-ups said it was fine." I leaned on his counter and asked, "What happens if the access was fake?" He rubbed his neck nervously. "Then we'd be in violation of property law. But if you're a shareholder now, you might be able to call for an internal review." That sentence was music to my ears. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out with a grin that probably confused him. That evening, I called Henry, the old attorney friend who'd been keeping tabs on the situation. "You're moving faster than I thought," he said when I told him about my new status. "You've got them cornered in their own boardroom." I told him my next plan: file an internal audit request under the shareholder clause and force the company to publicly verify all land rights tied to their new installations. Once that hit the system, the HOA's fake paperwork would glow like a neon sign in a blackout. Henry laughed and said, "You're not just cutting their power. You're cutting their story." That phrase stuck with me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about teaching them the difference between authority and arrogance. A few days later, I got an official notice from the HOA. It was printed on glossy paper, covered in flowery language, and signed by Karen herself. Community members are hereby reminded that unauthorized interference with ongoing electrical infrastructure may result in legal consequences. I laughed so hard I nearly dropped it in my coffee. She was threatening me on my own land, using electricity I technically now owned a piece of. I framed the letter and hung it in my living room. It was too good a souvenir to throw away. I knew what was coming next: the ceremony. The HOA was planning a grand ribbon cutting to celebrate their achievement, complete with local news coverage. I marked the date on my calendar because I had plans for that day too. In the days leading up to the event, I doubled my investment quietly, buying up enough shares through a broker to push myself past the threshold that allowed direct decision-making authority. By the time anyone noticed, it would be too late. The company's finances were so bad that my offers went through faster than I expected. Late one night, I refreshed the dashboard and saw it. The update that made me the majority shareholder. The irony was electric. The wires that crossed my fence now legally reported to me. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the flickering light bulb above me, and whispered, "Looks like I finally own the current." The next morning, I drove to the substation on the edge of town. The gates were open, workers moving in and out, unaware that the man walking past them owned everything they were touching. I chatted casually with the technician about the HOA line and asked where it connected. He pointed out a row of new transformers, all shiny and humming. "That's the one running through the new HOA sector," he said. "It's on your route, isn't it?" I smiled and said, "You could say that." I stood there for a while, watching the hum of energy pulse through cables that had once symbolized intrusion but now felt like power in its purest form. That night, Karen and her board posted photos online of the upcoming event: balloons, banners, and a big sign reading, "Powering a Better Tomorrow." I nearly choked on my drink laughing. Tomorrow was indeed going to be powerful, just not in the way she expected. I drafted a letter to the power company's regional office, citing my new ownership status and requesting a compliance check on the HOA's easement documents. By law, they had to suspend any disputed lines during the review. The timing couldn't have been better. The notice would hit their inboxes just hours before the ribbon cutting. As the sun went down, the sound of crickets filled the air and my land glowed under the faint buzz of the new poles. I looked at those lines and thought about how quickly arrogance can turn into a liability. Karen wanted to control a neighborhood, but I was about to control the current flowing to her porch light. There was something poetic about it, almost biblical: the trespasser caught in her own web, the self-proclaimed leader standing on wires she didn't own. I spent the rest of the night making sure every document, every purchase record, every ownership paper was airtight. I wanted no mistakes, no gaps, nothing she could twist in her favor. By midnight, I leaned back, exhausted but satisfied. The trap was built, the switch was wired, and all that was left was to wait for morning. When dawn arrived, the valley shimmered with a golden haze. I could see people gathering near the new line, laughter echoing faintly across the field. Karen's white SUV was already parked near the banner, her voice booming through a cheap microphone as she rehearsed her speech. I watched from a distance, leaning against my truck, knowing something she didn't. Somewhere deep in the power company's servers, an automated flag had just gone up, unauthorized easement detected. Within the hour, compliance teams would shut down the line pending investigation. I didn't even have to flip a switch. All I had to do was wait. The sun climbed higher, the crowd clapped, and Karen raised her scissors with that smug smile of victory. I smiled too, whispering to myself, "Go ahead, cut it. You'll be cutting more than ribbon today." The morning of the ribbon cutting was so bright it almost felt staged, the kind of day that begged for photographs and perfect smiles. The HOA members were already swarming near the fence line, cars parked crooked on the roadside, their chatter carrying across the field like the buzzing of overly confident bees. From my porch I could see the big banner stretched between two poles that read, "Powering the Future Together," flapping proudly in the breeze as if it wasn't stapled to lies. Karen stood near the center of it all, dressed like a politician on campaign day, wearing a red blazer that practically shouted attention, sunglasses perched on her head, clipboard in hand, barking instructions at volunteers who clearly wished they were anywhere else. I poured myself a cup of coffee and leaned on the railing, watching the show unfold from a distance. The news crew was setting up, their camera pointed straight at the gleaming new poles running across my land. It was poetic in a way, her entire empire of arrogance displayed on something that legally belonged to me. Around mid-morning I drove down to the site, slow and deliberate, my truck tires crunching on gravel. A few people turned to look, and I caught a flicker of recognition on Karen's face. For a split second she looked uneasy, but she quickly recovered, pasting on that fake smile she used when she thought she was winning. "Well, look who decided to join the celebration," she said, stepping forward. I got out of the truck, tipped my hat slightly and replied, "Wouldn't miss it for the world. I'm quite invested in how this project turns out." The double meaning went right over her head. She gestured grandly toward the crowd and said, "You see? This is progress. This is community. These new lines will finally bring stability to everyone here. You could have been part of it, you know, if you hadn't been so stubborn." I looked around at the poles cutting through my field and said calmly, "Oh, I'm very much a part of it, Karen. More than you realize." Her smile faltered just a little, and I could see the hint of uncertainty creep back into her eyes. The mayor arrived a few minutes later, a cheerful man who probably had no idea he was walking into a disaster. He shook Karen's hand, posed for a few pictures, and complimented her on community leadership. The crowd clapped politely. Then she took the microphone, stepping up to the small podium they'd set up on the back of a flatbed truck. Her voice carried proudly through the speakers. "Today marks a new chapter for our beautiful community," she declared. "A future where we are self-sufficient, connected, and powered by cooperation." I stood there in the back, arms crossed, watching the irony unfold while my phone buzzed quietly in my pocket with an incoming notification from the power company's internal system. I didn't need to look at it yet. I already knew what it said. As she continued her speech, the sky started to darken slightly with gathering clouds. It wasn't a storm, just enough to dim the sunlight and make the air heavy with tension. She talked about teamwork, unity, and all the nonsense she loved to wrap around her authority. Every few sentences, the crowd would clap, more out of politeness than excitement. Then she gestured dramatically toward the row of power poles and said, "With these lines we connect every home, every family, and every heart." I muttered under my breath, "and every trespassing violation." Just then, a low rumble of thunder rolled through the valley, perfectly timed like nature itself had joined my side of the joke. When she finally called for the ceremonial ribbon to be cut, everyone moved closer. The giant red ribbon stretched across two metal stands, and the news camera zoomed in. Karen held the oversized scissors high like she was about to crown herself queen of electricity. The mayor counted down from 3, and just as she snipped the ribbon, The air was split by the faint pop of a transformer discharging in the distance. The lights on the temporary setup flickered once, then died completely. The microphones went silent. The sound system crackled and fell quiet. For a heartbeat, the entire field froze. Then the murmurs started, followed by confused glances and whispers. Karen blinked, looking up at the poles like she couldn't believe what just happened. I checked my phone, pretending to be casual, and there it was. The confirmation message from the compliance office. Unauthorized grid connection detected. Power line deactivated pending investigation. Karen tried to laugh it off. Just a minor technical issue, she said, waving her hands toward the crowd. Nothing to worry about. But her voice trembled slightly. The camera crew whispered among themselves, and one of the electricians who had been hired for the event hurried over to her, whispering in her ear. I could see her face change color, from red to pale to an alarming shade of disbelief. She turned toward me sharply, her sunglasses slipping down her nose. "Did you do this?" she hissed. I shrugged. "Me? I'm just here enjoying the show." She took a step closer, pointing her finger like an angry teacher. "You sabotaged it. You can't stand to see progress." I chuckled softly. "Progress built on lies doesn't last long. Looks like the current caught up with you." Rain began to drizzle lightly, as if the sky wanted to wash the embarrassment off the field. The mayor mumbled something about checking with the power department and hurried to his car. The crowd started to thin, people shaking their heads, trying not to laugh. Karen stood frozen, clutching her clipboard like it might save her. One of her board members whispered something, and she snapped, "No one leaves. We'll fix this." But no one listened. Within minutes, her grand ceremony had turned into a ghost gathering. I walked closer to her, lowering my voice so only she could hear. "You should have checked whose land you were standing on before bragging about ownership." She turned toward me with fire in her eyes. "You'll regret this," she said, voice shaking. "We have connections." I smiled. "So do I. Only mine are legal." I turned and walked back to my truck, the wet gravel crunching under my boot. Behind me, I heard her shouting into her phone, demanding to speak to someone from the electric company. I could almost predict how that conversation would go. By the time she learned that the company had frozen all operations due to an internal compliance order initiated by a shareholder, which happened to be me, the panic would fully set in. The idea that the man she had mocked and trespassed against now held the very switch controlling her power must have felt like a lightning bolt to her pride. As I drove off, I passed a few of the workers packing up equipment. One of them recognized me and said quietly, "You the landowner?" "Smart move, sir. They didn't follow half the procedures." I nodded. "I know. That's why the lights went out." He laughed softly and shook his head. "Never seen a ceremony end faster." The rain picked up, gentle but steady, and by the time I reached the top of the hill overlooking the valley, the banner had collapsed, sagging into the mud. I stopped for a moment, watching the scene below, a field of damp balloons, retreating cars, and one furious HOA president waving her arms at the empty sky. It was the kind of justice money couldn't buy, the slow, satisfying kind that came from patience and precision. That night, the story made it to the local news under the headline, "Technical Glitch Halts HOA Power Launch." The anchor tried to sound serious, but there was a hint of humor in her tone. The comments section was brutal. People mocked the HOA for spending thousands on a project that didn't even make it through the ribbon cutting. I watched it all unfold from my couch, sipping coffee and smiling to myself. The reporter ended the segment by saying, "The company has announced an investigation into property access violations." I raised my mug toward the screen like a toast. It wasn't over yet, but the first wave had landed perfectly. The next step would be even brighter, and Karen had no idea the worst blackout of her life was still ahead. The morning after the blackout ceremony, the town was buzzing with whispers that spread faster than the current that once flowed through those stolen lines. Every diner, every gas station, Every porch conversation circled around the same question. How could the HOA's grand project fail so spectacularly in front of cameras? I didn't have to guess what Karen's morning looked like. She was probably pacing her spotless kitchen, yelling into her phone, and demanding answers from anyone who would pick up. The headlines online were relentless, calling it the Power Outage Parade and the HOA that couldn't keep the lights on. I sat on my porch, coffee steaming in the cool air, watching the faint morning fog drift across the silent poles that had once hummed with stolen energy. It was peaceful again, almost poetic. My phone buzzed with a new message from the utility company. It was an update confirming what I already knew. The board had approved my request for a full audit of the HOA's installation permit. Their lawyers were reviewing every signature and every map, and they had already found discrepancies so blatant that even the clerk at the county office called me to laugh about it. "They signed your name wrong 3 times," he said, "and one of the witnesses listed doesn't even exist." I thanked him, hung up, and leaned back, feeling the satisfaction sink in slow and deep. Around noon, a white SUV came speeding up my driveway, throwing dust in every direction. I didn't need to see the license plate to know who it was. Karen got out before the car even stopped moving, her heels sinking into the dirt, her expression a mix of rage, disbelief, and pure desperation. She slammed the door so hard the window rattled. "You think this is funny?" she shouted, marching toward my porch. "You humiliated me in front of the whole community." I set my mug down and said, "No, Karen, you did that all by yourself." She pointed a trembling finger at me. "You shut down the power on purpose. You sabotaged the ceremony." I raised an eyebrow and replied, "You built the line on land you don't own, forged papers you didn't understand, and connected a system you had no right to touch." "I didn't sabotage anything. I just let the truth catch up." She froze, her mouth opening but no sound coming out. I stood and walked down the steps slowly until I was eye level with her. "Here's the part you're missing," I said calmly. "I didn't just get the line shut off. I own it now. Every transformer, every cable, every pole that runs through this land belongs to me through the grid company. You were so busy cutting ribbons, you didn't notice who was buying your power source out from under you." For a long moment she just stared, her anger deflating as the meaning of my words sank in. Then she shook her head, muttering, "You're bluffing. You can't own the grid." I smiled. "Go ahead, call your electric provider. Ask who the majority shareholder is. Tell them you'd like to speak to your new landlord." She hesitated, fumbling for her phone, her hands shaking. I walked back to the porch and sat down again, watching her dial furiously. She demanded to speak to someone in authority, her tone shifting from outrage to panic. After a few moments, her face went pale. "That can't be right," she whispered into the phone. Then louder, "That's impossible." She hung up slowly, glaring at me with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "You can't just buy a company," she shouted. "That's illegal." I laughed softly. "You forged government documents, trespassed on private land, and endangered lives with unsafe wiring, but sure, I'm the one breaking the law." She stomped back toward her SUV, muttering something about lawyers, but I could tell her confidence had cracked. The mighty HOA president had just learned what it felt like to lose control, and for the first time, she had no rulebook to hide behind. By evening, word had spread through the community that the utility company had new ownership and that all HOA-related installations were under immediate review. Residents began calling the company to ask why their bills were suddenly addressed to Private Grid Holdings, 22B Division. That name had a nice ring to it, I thought. The few neighbors who weren't fans of the HOA found the whole thing hilarious. One even stopped by with a six-pack just to congratulate me. "Never thought I'd see someone outsmart Karen," he said between laughs. "You turned her little project into your empire." I smiled but stayed humble about it. Revenge is best when it's quiet and undeniable. The next day, the utility sent technicians to inspect the illegal connections. They found that the HOA contractors had cut corners on nearly every safety measure. Improper grounding, exposed cables, even a transformer that wasn't rated for the load. The report was brutal, and the company forwarded it to the county for investigation. Within hours, the county issued a formal notice to the HOA ordering an immediate shutdown of all ongoing work until ownership and safety compliance were verified. Karen, however, refused to accept defeat. She sent out a mass email to every resident titled "Restoring the HOA's Power and Dignity," claiming the outage was a temporary delay caused by malicious interference. I read it twice and laughed so hard my stomach hurt. She even accused me of harassing workers and tampering with community progress. The irony was too thick to ignore. I printed that email and added it to the framed letter in my living room. It was starting to look like a museum of bad decisions. Henry called later that evening and said, "I saw the news again. You're officially the talk of the county. Everyone's calling this the Great Power Plot. You might end up in the paper." I said, "Only if they print my good side." He laughed and added, "You've set a new record for lawful revenge. Even I'm impressed." Over the next few days, the HOA scrambled to hire lawyers, but they were fighting a losing battle. Every time they tried to file a complaint, they ran into one inconvenient fact. Their entire power infrastructure now fell under the control of a company they didn't own, and the man who did wasn't returning their calls. When the first batch of invoices arrived, billing them for property use and maintenance fees, Karen nearly exploded. I knew because one of the technicians told me later that she stormed into their office, waving the paper and yelling that it was extortion. The receptionist, bless her patience, simply pointed at the fine print that said, "Authorized by majority shareholder." Karen demanded to speak to the owner, and the receptionist calmly said, "He's already spoken to you, ma'am. You were standing in his pasture." The town started treating the whole thing like a running joke. Someone even made a meme of Karen holding her ribbon-cutting scissors with the caption, "Cut the power, not the ribbon." It circulated faster than her HOA notices ever did. Each new rumor about her frustration felt like a small victory I didn't have to lift a finger for. Meanwhile, I focused on formalizing my ownership, establishing a small company of my own under the name Ranchline Energy. It sounded professional enough to make even the county commissioners nod respectfully. I decided that any legitimate residents who had been tricked by the HOA's false promises would get free power for a few months, just to make sure the story ended with fairness instead of spite. The difference between revenge and justice, I realized, is whether the lesson helps others too. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the golden light stretched across my land, I took a slow walk along the line of poles. The air was quiet again, peaceful, interrupted only by the distant hum of the grid running under my control. I thought about how quickly arrogance had turned to downfall, how one forged paper had become the crack that split an entire empire of pettiness. Karen had tried to play queen, but she never realized the board she played on belonged to someone else. I stopped beside the transformer box that had started it all, its metal shell still gleaming faintly in the fading light. I reached out, ran my hand along it, and smiled to myself. They thought they were building over me, but all along I was building under them. The current was mine now, and so was the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the best revenge doesn't need shouting. It just needs a flip of a switch. For the first time in weeks, the valley nights were pitch dark, no porch lights glowing, no hum of air conditioners, just the wind sweeping across the hills and the occasional sound of distant crickets. The HOA neighborhood that once bragged about being the most modern community in the county had gone completely silent, their power cut indefinitely while the investigation dragged on. I had warned them, in my calmest voice, that unpaid property fees and unauthorized lines came with consequences, but they laughed it off at first. They thought I was bluffing, that I couldn't possibly control their lights from my old ranch house at the edge of town. Then, one Friday evening, the invoices went unpaid and the grace period expired. I sat in my study, sipping coffee, as the automatic disconnection protocol rolled out across the grid. Within minutes, messages started pouring into the utility dashboard. Power interruption in Sector B, transformer inactive in HOA Block 4, emergency ticket created by user HOA president. I could almost hear the screams from across the field. The darkness was spreading faster than gossip, one house after another blinking out until the entire neighborhood was swallowed in black. At first, the silence was satisfying, a kind of justice that hummed low and steady in my chest. But then the phones started ringing, neighbors calling, panicked voices trying to understand what had happened. Some were polite, confused, decent folks who had nothing to do with the HOA's greed, and I explained that once the legal review cleared, their service would return. They understood, most of them, because they'd lived under Karen's reign long enough to know she had brought this on herself. But others weren't so kind. A few shouted threats, one even said I was holding the community hostage. I hung up calmly after reminding them that no one forced the HOA to trespass on my land. Meanwhile, Karen was spiraling. By the third day of blackout, she had set up emergency meetings in the dark clubhouse, using flashlights and half-dead lanterns to lead her little rebellion. Someone sent me a photo of her standing at the front, yelling at her board members while they fanned themselves with paperwork. I saved it. It was too perfect not to. The funniest part was the rumor that spread around town. Some folks started saying I had installed a secret kill switch in my barn, like a mad scientist hoarding electricity for myself. Kids dared each other to ride past my property at night, whispering about the man who owns the power. I didn't correct them. Let the myth grow, it made things easier. Every time the HOA complained to the power company, they were politely told the same thing. Until the property dispute was settled, no reactivation could proceed without the landowner's written consent. My name sat at the bottom of every document. My consent was not coming. Karen called me at least 6 times that week, each time angrier than the last. The first call started with shouting, the second with begging, and by the 6th she was threatening legal action again. I let her talk until she ran out of breath, then simply said, "You trespassed on my land and lied to the county. Now you can enjoy your candlelit meetings." She hung up mid-scream. By the end of that week, desperation was setting in. I'd see HOA members driving into town to buy generators, their SUVs loaded with fuel cans, the same people who once bragged about eco-friendly policies now burning gasoline to keep their fridges cold. A few tried to connect illegal extensions to neighboring grids, but those efforts tripped the safety breakers instantly. The company's compliance team, under my direction, had everything sealed tighter than a bank vault. Every move they made was met with silence or shutdown. And through all of it, the county stayed firmly on my side. The zoning board had released its first public statement confirming that the HOA's construction violated land use laws, and now they faced fines that could bankrupt them. It was poetic. Each light they had illegally installed now represented a penalty fee. Karen tried one last stunt by inviting a local news crew to her darkened cul-de-sac. She wanted sympathy, to make me look like some rural tyrant cutting power to innocent families. But when the reporter arrived and asked for proof of ownership, Karen stammered, fumbling through her fake document. The cameraman caught every second of it, and by the next morning, the clip had gone viral. The public wasn't buying her story. They sided with me, the landowner who had been trampled by HOA arrogance. Still, the blackout dragged on, and the nights grew even quieter. Some residents left to stay with relatives, others started attending town meetings begging for mediation. I attended one of those meetings myself, mostly out of curiosity. The hall was dimly lit by emergency lanterns, which felt fitting for the topic. Karen was at the front, her voice hoarse from days of arguing. "We can't live like this," she said dramatically. "He's turned off our basic rights." I raised my hand from the back. "Electricity isn't a right when it's stolen," I said. The room turned. For a moment no one spoke. Then one of the older residents sighed and said, "He's got a point, Karen. That simple sentence cracked what was left of her authority. She turned red, stammering, "You don't understand, he's manipulating the system." I replied, "No, Karen. I just learned how to use it better than you." The audience laughed softly, the kind of laughter that signaled the end of her reign. As I left the hall that night, I realized how much the balance of power, literal and symbolic, had shifted. I hadn't just won against a petty HOA. I had shown an entire town that entitlement collapses when faced with quiet determination. On my way home, the dark streets shimmered faintly from the moonlight reflecting off the dead street lamp. It was eerie, yes, but also satisfying. The same poles they once used to trespass on my property now stood as monuments to their downfall. When I reached my ranch gate, the hum of my generator greeted me like an old friend. My house glowed softly, the only beacon for miles. I didn't need to rub it in, but I did enjoy the sight. A few days later, I received an email from the utility company confirming that the HOA had officially defaulted on their interim contract fees. That meant I could legally begin auctioning access rights for the power network that ran through my land. I forwarded the notice to the county office with one line: "Initiate ownership enforcement." Within 48 hours, a crew was dispatched to disconnect every meter associated with the HOA's fraudulent line. The final switch-off happened in broad daylight, right in front of their clubhouse. Karen stood there again, helpless, watching as the technicians removed the cables and sealed the panels. Someone recorded her shouting, "You can't do this," while the lead engineer calmly replied, "Ma'am, we're under the authority of the property owner." The look on her face when he pointed toward me, standing by my truck, was priceless. I didn't say a word. I just tipped my hat. That night, as the sun sank behind the ridges and darkness reclaimed the neighborhood for good, I stood on my porch once more. The wind carried faint voices from across the valley, angry, tired, defeated. But under it all was something else, a strange peace that comes when justice finally lands where it belongs. My land was quiet again, untouched and mine. The grid hummed steady in the distance, now a symbol of order instead of intrusion. I thought back to that first day, the sparks, the shouting, the smell of burnt grass, and I smiled. They thought they could run their wires through my soil without consequence. They never imagined the man they mocked would end up owning the current flowing under their feet. As I flipped the small control breaker inside my barn to shut down the last stray connection, the night deepened around me, calm and still. In that silence I realized that power doesn't just come from electricity. It comes from patience, precision, and knowing exactly when to turn off the lights. By the time the court summons arrived, the story had spread so far that it felt like half the county already knew every detail before the first hearing even began. The HOA, desperate and humiliated, had decided to sue, claiming I had illegally seized control of essential infrastructure and intentionally caused emotional distress to residents. I couldn't help but laugh when I read the complaint, because it was signed by the same person who had forged my name just weeks earlier. Karen's arrogance had officially crossed from foolish to suicidal. I handed the document to Henry, who chuckled and said, "This is the legal equivalent of lighting a match in a fireworks store." The courtroom was packed on the day of the hearing, full of curious locals, reporters, and even a few HOA residents who couldn't resist watching their own leadership implode. Karen strutted in wearing a navy blue suit and a forced smile, her hair pinned perfectly, but her eyes restless and darting. I sat quietly with my lawyer, a calm man who didn't need to grandstand because the truth was on our side. When the judge entered, the room fell silent except for the faint rustle of papers. Karen stood up first, full of false confidence, and began her speech about community unity and the abuse of power. She spoke like a politician cornered, her voice trembling just enough to betray her fear. The judge listened politely, then turned to me and asked for my side. I stood, handed him a thick folder of property records, shareholder documents, and the utility company's compliance reports. "Your Honor," I said evenly, "this isn't a story of power abuse. It's a story of property theft. The judge flipped through the pages, his eyebrows slowly rising. "These signatures," he said, "are clearly different." Karen's lawyer tried to interrupt, but the judge raised his hand. "No need," he said. "I can see with my own eyes these forms were falsified." He turned to Karen. "Did you personally authorize this submission?" Karen stammered, "Well, it was a misunderstanding, Your Honor. The documents were handled by the HOA secretary." The judge leaned back and said, "So your organization submitted fraudulent paperwork to acquire access across private land?" The room buzzed with quiet laughter. Karen's face turned red. My lawyer stepped forward and added, "And, Your Honor, my client didn't just own the land in question. He also legally purchased controlling shares of the grid provider the HOA partnered with. So, technically, the plaintiff's electricity flowed through assets owned by my client." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the reporters froze. Karen's mouth fell open, and one of her board members muttered a low curse under his breath. The judge rubbed his temples, clearly stunned by the sheer audacity of the HOA's actions. "This," he said finally, "is one of the most extraordinary cases I've seen. You trespassed on his property, forged his signature, and then accused him of cutting your own power." Karen tried to recover, insisting that her intentions were for the greater good. She spoke about beautifying the area, community progress, all those buzzwords she loved to throw around when cornered. But the judge wasn't having it. "Good intentions," he said, "don't justify breaking the law." When he asked if she had evidence that I caused emotional distress, her lawyer awkwardly presented a few complaint letters from HOA members describing how they had to use candles and eat dinner by flashlight. The courtroom erupted in laughter. Even the judge cracked a small smile. When it was my turn to speak again, I said, "Your Honor, I didn't deprive them of power. I simply refused to supply them illegally." Then I gestured to the compliance report showing how the power line had been installed without permits or inspection. "If I hadn't intervened," I continued, "this could have caused an electrical fire or worse. I didn't shut down their power, I prevented a disaster." The judge nodded slowly. The logic was undeniable. By the second day of the hearing, it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Karen's confidence had melted into desperation. She tried crying on the stand, claiming she was just following advice and didn't mean to cause trouble. Her voice cracked in a way that sounded rehearsed. My lawyer didn't even have to cross-examine her much. The evidence spoke louder than any argument. Then came the defining moment. The utility company's regional manager took the stand to confirm the ownership records. He held up the purchase documents, clearly stamped and dated, showing my acquisition of majority shares. "As of 3 weeks prior to the outage," he said, "the grid segment in question was legally controlled by Mr. Walters." The judge looked at Karen, then at me. "So you sued the man who owns the very system you're complaining about?" Karen's lawyer muttered, "It appears so." The judge set the papers down, took off his glasses, and sighed deeply. "Case dismissed," he said. The gavel hit the desk with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. "And," he added, "this court orders the HOA to compensate Mr. Walters for property damage, legal costs, and any future land use fees." The room erupted into murmurs. Karen's shoulders slumped, her composure completely shattered. She turned to her lawyer, whispering furiously, but he only shook his head and began packing his papers. As I walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed around, microphones in my face, asking how it felt to win against the HOA. I simply said, it wasn't about winning. It was about reminding people that property lines mean something. The clip made the evening news, and soon everyone was talking about how the HOA queen had been dethroned in front of a full courtroom. Even the judge's final quote, "You trespassed on his land and his grid," became a headline. I got calls from neighboring towns, messages from people who'd fought their own HOAs and wanted advice. For once, I realized this story had grown beyond my little ranch. It had become a symbol of standing your ground, literally and figuratively. That night, back at the ranch, I sat on the porch as the wind carried faint laughter and chatter from the nearby hills. The darkness was peaceful again, the air clean, the lights on my property glowing softly while the rest of the valley remained dim. A few headlights appeared in the distance. It was Henry, who had driven over with a bottle of whiskey to celebrate. He stepped out, grinning like a man who just watched his favorite movie twice. "I told you this would end in your favor," he said. I poured us 2 glasses, and we sat there, silent for a moment, listening to the faint buzz of the power lines overhead. "You know," he said after a while, "that woman will probably move away. She'll never recover from this." I nodded slowly. "She built her reputation on control," I said, "and now she's powerless." We laughed at that, clinking glasses as the stars stretched across the sky. I thought about how quickly arrogance turns into downfall, how a simple refusal to be bullied had turned into a full-blown legal triumph. But more than anything, I felt relief. The noise, the chaos, the trespass, it was all over. My land was quiet, my fences intact, and my grid humming exactly as it should. Before Henry left, he raised his glass one more time and said, "You didn't just win, you rewired the meaning of power." I watched his taillights disappear down the dirt road, then looked up at the poles stretching across the horizon. For months they had been symbols of intrusion, but now they stood for something else, proof that sometimes the best revenge isn't loud or violent. It's lawful, patient, and absolute. I leaned back, exhaled slowly, and whispered to the empty night, "You trespassed on my land and my grid. And now you'll pay for every volt." The wind carried the words away like electricity through a wire, quiet but unstoppable. Months passed after the court case, and the valley slowly returned to normal, though the meaning of normal had changed for everyone involved. The HOA, once a symbol of rigid control and self-importance, was now a ghost of its former self. The sign at its entrance had faded, the flowers around it wilted, and the community newsletter that used to arrive every Friday morning had stopped altogether. The residents no longer spoke of board meetings or enforcement rules. They spoke instead about the day the lights went out, the courtroom showdown, and how the woman who once acted like a queen of the valley had lost her crown in the most public way possible. I didn't go looking for attention, but it found me anyway. Local papers ran headlines calling me the man who bought the grid, and a regional magazine even wanted to interview me about rural sovereignty. I turned that down. I didn't want to be a symbol or a celebrity. I just wanted peace, the kind that hums quietly through the soil when no one is trying to take what isn't theirs. By spring, I had made the decision to turn the entire situation into something better than revenge. The old power infrastructure that ran through my land had potential far beyond the HOA's petty project. With the help of a few engineers from the utility company, now under my management, I began establishing a small cooperative called Ranchline Energy, a local power co-op that would serve nearby farms and houses directly. It wasn't about profit anymore. It was about giving the valley control over its own electricity instead of letting committees and con artists run it. When the first customers signed up, they laughed when they saw my name on the paperwork. "You're the guy who turned the HOA dark," one farmer said, shaking my hand. "Now you're lighting up the rest of us." There was something poetic about that, turning a grudge into growth. The same poles that once symbolized intrusion now carried honest power, paid for fairly, grounded in respect. One afternoon, as I was inspecting a transformer near the edge of my property, a familiar car pulled up. It was Karen's SUV, though it looked older now, dusty and dull, a reflection of her fall from grace. She stepped out slowly, dressed simply for once, no sunglasses, no clipboard, just exhaustion on her face. I didn't say anything at first. I let the silence do the talking. She took a deep breath and said, "I came to apologize." The words hung awkwardly in the air. For a moment I wasn't sure if she meant them, but her voice was different, quieter, stripped of that old arrogance. "I made mistakes," she continued. I thought I could fix everything by forcing everyone to follow one plan. I didn't realize I was breaking people instead. I studied her expression, the small tremor in her voice. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as another performance, but another part saw something real, something humbled. You didn't just break people, I said finally. You broke trust. And trust is harder to rebuild than any fence or power line. She nodded slowly, looking down at the ground. I know, she said softly. That's why I sold my house. I'm leaving the state. I can't stay here after all this. There was no triumph in hearing that, only a strange kind of closure. I didn't hate her anymore. She had built her world out of control and ego, and when that world collapsed, she was just a person again. Good luck, Karen, I said simply. She gave me a faint smile, then turned and got back into her car. As she drove off, I noticed a small sticker still clinging to her rear bumper. It read, "Community First." I almost laughed at the irony, but instead I whispered, "Maybe now you'll understand what that really means." Watching her car disappear down the road felt like the final light switch being flipped off on an old chapter of life. The weeks that followed were calm and steady. The co-op grew, and the valley's reputation changed from scandal to success. The story of what had happened became a kind of local legend, told around campfires and diners with a mixture of humor and awe. People liked the part where the HOA president fainted in court, or how the power went out exactly when she cut the ribbon. I didn't mind being the punchline or the hero. I'd learned that stories take on their own life once they leave your hand. The important part was that everyone in the valley now understood something essential. That power, whether electrical or personal, belongs to those who respect it, not those who abuse it. I kept a framed copy of the court's final ruling on my office wall, not as a trophy but as a reminder of how close I came to losing everything if I hadn't stood my ground. One evening, near the end of summer, I stood outside my barn watching the sunset paint the sky in bands of gold and violet. The new power lines stretched across the landscape, sturdy and well-built this time, humming softly in the warm breeze. I thought back to that first day, at the sparks, the smoke, the shouting, and how far it all had come. The air smelled of hay and distant rain, and somewhere in the pasture my horses grazed quietly, no longer startled by strange machines or shouting visitors. The peace felt earned. Henry stopped by again that night, this time bringing his old guitar. He said it was time to celebrate properly. We sat on the porch, played old songs, and laughed about how the universe sometimes uses foolish people to build wise outcomes. You know, Henry said between strums, most folks would have settled for suing them and walking away. But you went and bought the grid instead. That's a new kind of victory. I smiled and said, sometimes the only way to keep your land safe is to own everything that touches it. He laughed, shook his head, and said, you've got a saying for everything now. As the night deepened, the lights from my house cast a soft glow over the fields, bright but gentle, unlike the harsh floodlights the HOA used to install. I leaned back, sipping my drink, watching the faint shimmer of power lines tracing the edge of my land. They no longer felt like intrusions. They felt like boundaries drawn in light. For a long moment I just listened to the crickets, the low hum of current, the rhythm of a world finally balanced again. Before heading inside, I flipped the main switch in my barn just for the satisfaction of hearing the system click alive, every circuit responding exactly as it should. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months ago, they thought they could control my electricity. Now I controlled theirs, and more importantly, I controlled the peace that came with it. As the last of the sunset faded into darkness, I thought about everything that had happened, the greed, the trespass, the chaos, the courtroom, the laughter, and the lessons. It all boiled down to one truth that I had lived and proven. Power doesn't come from wires or authority or titles. It comes from patience, persistence, and principle. I looked across the quiet valley, the same land my grandfather once worked, and whispered to myself, you ran your lines through my land, but I run your lights. The wind carried those words softly through the night, and somewhere in the distance, a transformer clicked, steady and obedient.